Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Ladan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is my good friend, Tom Hughes. We actually met at the Neurotech Leaders Forum put on by Neurotech Reports in San Francisco in, I think it was October 2018. And we just really hit it off because I found out that he had traveled through a lot of the world in the 70s. So he basically took off 2.5 years and traveled all the way around the world, like went to Turkey, Afghanistan, India, Thailand, and he really was like one of the original, sorry to say, vagabonds or hippies that went on the hippie trail at that time. So I thought that was really interesting. And then basically his transition now into being a consultant, being actually a medical device consultant in reimbursement, specializing in reimbursement. So that was really interesting. So you can check out my other show on Travel Wisdom Podcast, and we kind of get into that more, the travel side of things and how he was able to make a transition. But we also get into, in this show, what he does. We also get into what the process looks like for medical device reimbursement. And a lot of times spin-offs or startups or something like this, they don't think about, hey, how am I actually going to get paid? It's more about, hey, how am I going to get the patent? How am I going to get FDA approved? But actually, turns out, in order to have a business, it needs to be self-sustainable and it needs to make a profit, it needs to make money. So this is a huge thing and a thing that a lot of people don't really think about. So check it out and we'll talk more on the other side. But I want to talk about a little bit about what you do too. So you're actually the second consultant that I've talked to in the medical field, medical device field. And so, what were you doing at the Neurotech Leaders Forum?
Thanks for asking that. And I haven't spent much time yet talking about it because I knew the main focus of this podcast was the travel discussion, and how it has shaped my interest in what I'm doing today. And what I'm doing today is I'm senior principal advisor at a clinical research organization headquartered here in Minneapolis called RCRI, and it stands for Regulatory and Clinical Research Institute. And they've been around for over 20 years, and we help medical technology companies in a number of different areas, helping them get through the regulatory pathway, quality, helping them do all phases of clinical trials, from design to monitoring to data management to helping them identify sites and conducting the trial. And then my job here is to work with those other teams on health economic and reimbursement initiatives. So I've been doing that here for over 2 years, and I was at the Neurotech Forum to speak to attendees about how startup companies, in particular in the neurotech area, can move from not only getting their product cleared or approved through the FDA, but actually getting it paid, and how important that is to think about that as early in the regulatory process as possible. In this brave new healthcare environment we're in, where demonstrating value is the mantra, you have to show that your product not only has gotten through the FDA, but you have to show other stakeholders after that, and primarily their hospitals and payers, depending on your technology. And by payers, I mean it could be Medicare or Medicaid or the private sector or work comp, you name it, that this product is worth purchasing or paying for. And so that was my overview discussion with some of these startup neurotech companies, and received a lot of feedback after my presentation because a lot of them are focused on designing their product. These are people who are very good and very innovative, creative people. And they also are very familiar with the first thing you have to do is get through the FDA, either cleared or approved, or you're not going to have a chance in the U.S. market. And I think they have spent less time in that process thinking how they're going to get it paid for. So that's where I came in. What I do is I help companies figure out coverage, coding, and payment for their technology. And there's a number of ways we can do that, but that's what I do now. And I've been doing it for off and on for 20 years. Inside medtech into companies, and then as a consultant, like I said. And then it's also evolved into helping companies understand the health economics and adding that to their trial designs. And that's one thing I talked about at the Neurotech Forum. Don't only think about developing data points to get through the FDA in your study design, which can often cost hundreds of thousands, if not a couple $1 million, depending on your technology. So if you're going to spend that money and time in your study design, at least consider the options for developing health economic endpoints to convince the stakeholders hospitals, health plans, Medicare, whoever your stakeholder is, that you have data points showing that your clinical outcomes are equal to or better than the standard of care, and also that you can show that it's cost effective versus your existing alternatives. Because what's going on is companies get so excited about their new technology, and they really believe in it, and rightly so. They have to, or else they wouldn't have an innovative technology. But you have to convince the people who pay for it that it's clinically effective and cost effective.
Wow, that's incredible. So I guess there's 3 hurdles for startups. Is basically you have to convince patent office that it's worth a patent. You have to convince the FDA that it's safe. And most people stop there. Most people are engineers. They're like, okay, we're finished. Now we can sell it. We can make money. But you're saying there's one more step, actually. You have to convince the payers that it's actually worth paying for as well.
Well put, Ladan, and that's pretty much it. The design features are critical, right? Because you got to have something that works well and that also is disruptive. I think if you can get a technology they don't all have to be disruptive, but if you can find a unique fit for your technology in the marketplace, and you got to show the FDA that it's safe and effective. But you're exactly right. You shouldn't stop there. And a lot of companies start to realize that now, but they don't know exactly what they do about demonstrating value and figuring out how to get it paid. And it's not as step-by-step as getting through I don't know about patents, I'm not that familiar with them, but at least getting through the FDA, if there's a template you follow and pre-sub meetings, if it's an IDE type of technology, you got to get that confirmed by the FDA, and then you go ahead and do your trial and all that entails, and then you get cleared or approved. So it's a step-by-step sequential approach, whereas reimbursement, you have to think of a lot of things at different times, and it's an iterative process, and it should start when you're thinking about your study design with the FDA, as I've already said. And you should consider at some point early on too, as soon as you know your potential indications for use that you're going to present to the FDA, you should be thinking about, okay, now that I know what the indications for use are, how it's going to be used, what my patient population is, what do I know about the reimbursement landscape? I need a snapshot of what the world looks like today for my type of technology, because if you're disruptive enough, you don't want to have your particular technology identified. But my type of technology, what existing codes are there out there in the hospital setting versus the outpatient versus the physician's office versus the home setting? Again, depending on your technology. Are there existing codes I can use? What's the Medicare payment attached to those codes? And I use the word Medicare payment because private payers don't reveal their pricing. So we use Medicare as a benchmark. And then, oh, by the way, and as very importantly, what are the payers? What is Medicare and or private payers? What are their policies about coverage? Is it medically necessary? So what I've just described to you, Ladan, is something that everybody should be thinking about as they're thinking about the FDA regulatory path, doing a reimbursement assessment of some sort. And it's generally a report that companies do internally or externally, and I do a lot of them, where they have an opportunity to see what that landscape looks like. And there's 3 elements to that I just described, and I call it the 3-legged stool. And this is what I told the audience at the Neurotech Forum. You have to think of reimbursement as a 3-legged stool. It's got 3 legs that have to be standing before you have reimbursement. That leg is a coding pathway. The second leg is payment attached to that coding. And the third leg is coverage. You need all 3 of those elements. And companies often call me in introductory calls, which we do a lot, initial calls to help them identify if they need to do an assessment or what else they need to do with general reimbursement consulting. They say, Tom, I think we have reimbursement. I have a code. And I'm thinking, okay, you have 1 leg of the stool, but you don't have reimbursement. And is that the right code? And sometimes the codes have to fit your technology specifically. There are different coding systems. What site of care are you in? So oftentimes I'll spend time learning from companies, where do you want to use this technology? Is it the hospital system? Is it the hospital outpatient? Are there ambulatory surgery centers? Is it the physician's office, the PT office? Is it home environment? Each one of these environments has different codes, structures, and different payments. Some have the same kind of codes, like physicians use CPT codes, current procedure terminology codes, to bill, but so do hospital outpatient settings. But those settings combine them into ambulatory payment classifications. And hospital outpatient will get a different payment amount than an ambulatory surgery center for the same code. And because of variables that exist with how Medicare has defined payment for those two sites of care. So companies, it gets complicated, and I'm getting into the weeds a little bit, which I do every day, but you can kind of get an idea, Ladan, as to why this is my mantra with startups especially. Think about this stuff. If you don't know all the details, find some people internally or externally who can help you figure it out, because it's critical. Because at some point, you're going to come up against investors, or you want to sell it to a bigger company, or whatever you want to do with it. You want to do your own, build up your company yourself. You're going to have to figure out at some point, people who have an interest in your organization or company to help it grow are going to have to figure out reimbursement, unless you want it self-pay, which not many companies are going to. Some do it, but it's not the primary mode of payment in healthcare.
Wow, this is fascinating. So what is the people that you have to convince? I mean, it sounds pretty complicated. Like you have to convince like individual hospitals and VA and like all these different sub-portions, or how does that work actually?
Yeah, it's a good question. It depends on the technology, Ladan. Let me think if I can give you an example of implantable brain stimulator, for example, because we're talking about the forum. And by the way, we do a lot of neurotech work as a clinical research organization, but obviously we do heart and other orthopedics, diabetes. We work with a lot of therapeutic areas, but let's stick with neurotechnology because you're in that field and I spend a lot of time there. If it's an implantable technology like a deep brain stimulator, something like that, you're going to be in the hospital setting where that work is performed. And so hospitals are paid under a diagnostic-related group of codes. So do you have a diagnostic, they're called DRGs. Is there a DRG that fits your type of procedure that you're performing that includes this deep brain stim? So it's an implantable. They're going to be done in an inpatient setting. Some technologies don't require overnight stay, so they'll be done in an outpatient setting. They're less invasive, using your medical technology that's needed to do this surgery in the outpatient setting or an ambulatory surgery center. So you would research the codes in that system and what the payers are saying about coverage for your particular similar technology in that environment. Does that help?
Yeah, that's interesting. So is this kind of the process, like if somebody comes to you and is like, I got a code, is this kind of the process that you go to after that?
Yeah, if they say I have a code, I'll say, okay, you need more than a code. You need to understand if that code applies to your technology, and you need to know what site of care it is, because sometimes you can use a technology. I'm thinking of another type of technology was for physiological monitoring. It started in the hospital setting, but they felt it could be going home with the patient too. So I looked at reimbursement in the hospital setting for this type of technology under DRG systems, or how that worked, and then actually included in the outpatient setting as well. And then I thought, okay, and this is what a lot of companies are doing now. They add these telehealth capabilities, remote patient monitoring. It's a brave new world we're in with connectivity. So the capability goes home with the patient. So there's a lot happening with coding in that world, to get back to your question. So they may not even know what they don't know. And so part of what I do is saying, okay, you think it's this code, then this setting, and you're right, but there may be other opportunities to get reimbursed and create value for your technology that you weren't aware of because of this other codes that exist in other sites of care or in your existing site of care. A lot of people will come and do their own informal research on coding, for example, and say, here's some codes I've identified. If they're coming to us, initially, they usually have not done a full-blown, in-depth reimbursement assessment. That includes not only coding analysis, but what the payers are saying and what the pricing is attached to those.
Interesting. So you kind of help them broaden it and potentially sell it in more markets, something like that, or get paid under more lucrative codes, something like that?
Yeah. And if the first step is to say, the first thing you want to do is find existing codes that fit your new technology. And if the price is right, the value proposition for the company, and they know more about where they want to be on, pricing for their technology. And I'll give them the pricing and tell them this is an approximation, an estimate of what you're going to get under this coding structure. And it looks like this code will apply to your technology. That's the best news that they get from an assessment. But if I'm telling them, you know what, there's nothing quite like your technology, and then I will help them understand what they have to do to get a new code, whether it's a CPT code through the American Medical Association or a HCPCS code that's a code that's an acronym for healthcare procedure codes that are used for products in the home setting, and otherwise what they have to do for those type of codes, or what you have to do to get an add-on payment for a DRG payment in the hospital setting. So we can kind of guide them on advice as to how to do that. And that'll be a result of my analysis and assessment.
Okay. And you're mostly working with startups, right? Like, how do you deal with that? I mean, aren't they usually cash straps? I mean, aren't these like the poorest people that you could work with?
Well, we don't mostly work with startups, to answer your question. We work with all types of companies. I mean, we're headquartered here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and you're at the forum, and you know that some of the largest medical device companies in the country, if not the world, are companies like Medtronic and Boston Scientific, and they do a lot of neurotech, and 3M Healthcare is located here. But we work with companies like that, and a lot of our people came out of those companies. And we still have relationships with some of the largest medtech companies and do work for them on different components. But we work with all sizes, to answer your question. A lot of startups in the neurotech area, yes, but companies that are developing new products that may be mid-size will come to us, and larger companies that need help with clinical trial design or getting through the FDA, and sometimes health economic and reimbursement components to that trial design will help small, medium, and large in the neurotech area. And neurotech is finding its way within investors, right? You know that. We learned that at the Neurotech Forum. Sometimes it doesn't take a lot of money to do the initial assessment and get some preliminary help on regulatory pathways. And investors often want that, right? Even from startups, they want to know, what does the landscape look like for getting through the FDA and getting paid for your product. But I know some startups do struggle with that, but found it to be a major hurdle as far as the work we can do initially to help them present something to the investment community. I do that a fair bit. I'd say 40% of my work has been with startups because investors want to know what their options are. And that doesn't, investors are, they've been around a lot. They're not saying if you don't have a code or don't have reimbursement, we're not going to consider your technology. They just want to know there are other considerations, because I've worked with a number of companies that have grown into very profitable companies that the main consideration was leadership, and also they had a technology that was unique and that really fit a need. And if you have that, you can work through the other stuff, and investors will figure that out and help you get there. They just want to know what the landscapes look like. Regulatory and reimbursement is often where they start, because what happens is that will help guide what sort of clinical trial design you need, if you understand that.
Oh, wow. So this is even before any FDA approval then, right?
Well, yes. It depends on the company, so I don't want to say that as an absolute, but more and more companies are, that's what one of my slides was in my presentation to the Neurotech members. It was, I think the theme of my presentation was, you've got a great design, now how are you going to pay for it? So, and one of my slides talks about 10 years ago, companies could get away with getting through the FDA all the way through, and they're not thinking about reimbursement, how to get it paid. But investors and others up front are saying, move that analysis of reimbursement up to the design phase of your clinical trial, and even sometimes in the design of your technology. I was working with a company last week that didn't do a great job of that, a company from overseas, and they had done the R&D, and they had not thought about the reimbursement pathway in the U.S., and if they had done some redesign to their technology, it would have been an easier path on reimbursement. And so they should think about that as they're designing the technology, what the reimbursement opportunities exist for that particular indication for use and design. And I think the indication use follows the design. So it's the engineers that are, like you said, are spending a lot of time on this, and they're working a lot initially. Okay, we have to get through the FDA. Is that a 510K? Is de novo or a PMA? And I presume the listeners understand those acronyms. But you identify that. But if it involves a clinical trial, and often sometimes 510K, which is the predicate path, de novo, where there's no predicate, often involves a clinical study, and PMA definitely does, pre-market approval. But if it involves the need, the FDA says you have to do a clinical trial, you should think about economic endpoints added to that clinical study. So you should bring in somebody to help you understand that reimbursement environment as you're thinking about meeting with the FDA and talking to them.
Yeah, definitely. They were definitely mentioning in my engineering school is like engineers, they just want to design the product, and not even for a need or anything like this, but you have to think more like an entrepreneur and think about the need and solve people's problems first, and then design the product and then do all this. So this is really excellent, Tom. I want to be respectful of your time. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
Well, you just made me think of something, and that is an article I wrote for Medical Outsourcing Magazine that kind of talks about this very same thing. And it just came out in October. But it kind of says everything I just said, but I don't have the link to it in front of me, but maybe I can forward it to you. But other than that, no, it's been a wonderful conversation, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you on the podcast. And I look forward to touching base with you offline, Ladan, and continuing our friendship.
Yeah, likewise. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed it. I really liked it. As I said, the other half is on the Travel Wisdom podcast, my other show, and we talk more about the travel side of things. But on this show, it was really interesting to hear, and it was really interesting to hear about the importance of reimbursement, and actually that it should be before maybe even FDA approval. And that will decide where you're going to be putting your money, where you're going to be putting your efforts, what your studies are going to look like, your clinical trials. And yeah, so this is really, really interesting. It's, as you guys may know, I'm really interested in startups, spin-offs, everything like this. One day I hope to found or co-found a company. So it's really cool to kind of be getting all the blocks, all the building blocks. Here's a Lego piece, here's this piece and this piece. And, it's starting to come together. It's starting to be like, okay, well, you need to do this first and then this and then this. And I had no idea that the reimbursement was so high on the priority list. I honestly thought that it was after you do patent and all this kind of stuff. So fascinating stuff. I really, really enjoyed it. Check out Tom Hughes' company. It's called RCRI. They are in Minneapolis. So check them out if you're interested in this kind of stuff, or reach out to him as well. Anyways, I hope you enjoy this. I hope you learned something new. Until next time.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.